One of the jobs I had when I was old enough to really have a job, I was a waiter and a busboy at a restaurant. The restaurant was positioned and conjoined with a racetrack. And so it was very fascinating because I got to watch people, and I also got to see horses, which it's always fun to watch horses run around the track. But watching people was really interesting. It's kind of a hobby of mine. I like to sit back and observe people. But as a waiter, you sometimes get really weird requests. And the first time it happened to me, I was taken aback by it. Somebody had ordered a glass of scotch. Okay, that's fine. They sell that there. But they wanted it mixed with water. And I didn't understand exactly why that was the case. And I had to stop and think about it for a minute. And I asked people, I asked my friend who happened to be the bartender, I said, why would they want to mix this with water? If they're paying all this money for this drink, why wouldn't they just want the full flavor and the full effect of having this drink? And they said, well, they want to have the flavor, they just don't want to have a lot of it. So you add some water to it to dilute it, to spread it out some, so it's not as powerful. And I kind of understood that, but it seemed to me to be a little bit of a waste of money. Again, if you were buying this, and you're spending your money on it, and you know what it's supposed to taste like, why would you want it to be weaker? But then I had to stop and think that this is something that we do on a daily basis. After all, not many of us drink our coffee black. But what do? We add sugar to it. We add creamer. I myself am a fan of French vanilla cream in coffee because I like French vanilla. I'll only drink black coffee if the coffee itself is strong enough to keep me awake for 12 hours and there is no cream and sugar around. We also do the same to tea. We'll add sweet and low, or we'll add sugar, or we'll add honey, and we'll add more water in case the tea is too strong. Because we feel like we cannot handle the full force of the beverage that we have. I think that's where the phrase water it down comes from. So you're not having to deal with the full power and the full effect of something. And again, this is something that we do all the time. We like the flavor of things, but we don't want it to be so in your face, do we? We like to go to restaurants and we like to order fish, but one of the highest compliments we can give fish is what? That it's not too fishy. Well, at what point then, why would you order the fish if you don't want the fish to be fishy? Because shouldn't fish be fishy? But what we'll do with that then is we'll take lemon and we'll squirt the lemon over it and we'll do all of these things to sort of mask the flavor, to dilute it, to make it not as strong. We change it from something that is strong to something that we can handle. Something, in effect, that is weaker. But on the other hand, why change it at all? If the point of eating or drinking something is to have that full flavor, why do we not just do that? And the reason is because it's us. Because we can't handle it. We can't handle the full force of coffee sometimes. We can't handle the full force of a glass of scotch sometimes. We can't handle the full flavor of fish sometimes. And I bring this up because one of the things that we don't talk about in churches is the fact that there is a watering down of the gospel of Jesus Christ. To be honest and frank, we should call it out for what it is. Heresy. That's what it is. Heresy is this belief that is strongly at odds with orthodox thoughts and cultures. So it's something that goes against the way that it's supposed to be. It could be something simple like, how you view bacon, how you view the role of women in church. All of these things, we have this system, we have this orthodoxy that has been going on for years and years and years and years. And sometimes things go against that. Sometimes it's something like, for example, if you're ever invited to a vegan barbecue, you wouldn't show up with a plate of bacon, would you? No, because that goes against the culture of the cookout that you're attending. It's a vegan gathering. So why then would you want to do something against that grain? But for us today as Christians, we see this all the time. We see people taking the gospel of Jesus Christ and twisting it. They change it. They make it more palatable. They change it so that people will come to listen to them, that they can feel good about themselves, that they can justify horrible and atrocious acts. This is what people do with the gospel. It's a heresy. It really is. And we don't call it out because we don't want to make waves, do we? We want to make sure everyone likes us. We want to be kind and gentle to everyone. But when we see this, when we know it's going on, how then can we let it continue? If I'm doing something wrong, I fully expect somebody to step in and tell me that I'm doing something wrong. My mom did it for me. My dad did it for me. My wife does it for me. If I am doing something wrong, somebody needs to come in and say, you need to do it this way. Either I'm doing it wrong, or I'm doing it in a way that makes absolutely no sense. And the reason that these people will come to me and say, hey, guess what? You're doing this wrong, is not because they're trying to have this air of superiority, but because they genuinely care about me. And they want what's best for me. So if I'm folding towels in an incorrect way, and I'm going to waste space in the drawer, it only makes sense that I'm told that I need to fold the towels in a proper way. If I'm not cutting the grass in the right way, and I'll just have to recut it again later, it makes sense for someone to tell me that I'm not doing it the right way. Because things need to be done in a correct, proper, or as we like to say in the Presbyterian Church, a decent and an orderly way. But we step back. We don't want to muddy the waters. We don't want people to be mad at us. And yet there are people in this country making millions of dollars pretending they speak for Jesus Christ, when what do they say? They say nothing but a watered-down version of the gospel. There is nothing about sin. There is nothing about repentance. There is nothing about loving your neighbor and caring for those who have no voice. And these people are using what they say is the gospel of Jesus Christ and pretend they are speaking for all of Christianity. And it's hurtful. And the reason that it's hurtful is because a watering down of the gospel makes us not be able to share the real, authentic gospel. The prophets called people out all the time. They weren't just sycophantic yes men telling the leaders of the world, oh no, you can totally do that because this God's on your side. No. When someone did something wrong, they were supposed to tell people what they were doing wrong. They called people out, and they called out powerful people at that. More to the point, they would call out other prophets. If they saw someone lying, and yes, lying is the only word that can be used here. If they saw someone lying, saying, God wants you to do this, they would say, that's really weird, because I just spoke to God, and God told me something completely different. They weren't afraid. But we are. But the prophets weren't afraid. That's why I love this passage in Ezekiel. See, Ezekiel has this word that comes from God. All throughout the book of Ezekiel, God is very adamant about what to call Ezekiel. And some translations will translate it as mortal. Some translations call it son of man. The Hebrew here is actually Ben Adam. I always like to translate this when I'm looking at this passage, when I'm looking at Ezekiel. I always like to translate it as son of Adam. And the reason is because the reason God calls Ezekiel this is to denote that Ezekiel is not God. That Ezekiel is of the created order. And so pairing him as a member of Adam's family, to me, really drives that point home. But that's what the mortal, the son of man in this context, that's what all that means. He comes to Ezekiel, mortal, prophesy against the prophets of Israel. Now this in and of itself is fascinating, isn't it? Because the people of Israel are God's chosen people. And you would think that God would not want to upset them. That these prophets who are speaking on behalf of God, they wouldn't want to say, well, what if someone doesn't like the message and they get upset and leave? No. God said, call them out. Be blunt about it. You see, these people that Ezekiel is talking to, they're dealing with the fallout of not listening to God already. Dealing with the issues of the Babylonian exile. And these sycophants, these yes men that are there telling these people, oh, everything's fine, not to worry, don't panic. They're completely missing the point of all things. It's kind of like this. When my wife leaves and goes out somewhere, almost inevitably she'll call and she'll be like, okay, hey, how are the kids? And I'll be like, oh yeah, they're fine. Immediately as I say the words, they're fine, do you know what happens? An ear-piercing scream breaches the house. And no, they're not fine. But dads, they don't want to admit that, right? So they'll say, everything is fine, everything is under control, you have nothing to worry about. Meanwhile, it sounds like World War III has broken out in the background. And so what we'll do is, we'll lie. We'll nice, gentle, soft lies. And we'll say, no, everything's fine. But everything isn't fine. That's what these so-called prophets are doing. They are telling these people, oh, everything's fine. Everything's going to be fine. You don't have to worry. You just do you, and everything's going to be A-OK, hunky-dory. But that's not what's going on. They're trying to calm the people. They're playing to people's emotions. They're giving them a watered-down message instead of what God actually wants. The Babylonian exile was a terrible thing for the Israelite people. It really was. It served a purpose, though. The purpose was to show the people just how much they needed God in their lives. Nothing happens in this world that is out of God's control. Now, we may not like that. We may not want it to happen that way. But at the end of the day, what do? We trust that God knows what God is doing. And so these people are coming up and saying, oh no, everything's fine. And God's sitting back there on God's throne going, no, it's not going to be fine. You're lying. And so Ezekiel gets his sassy pants on and he goes and talks to these prophets. He says, all you're doing, like you've got this wall. And you're not fixing the wall at all. All you're doing is you're slapping a coat of paint on it to make everyone think that everything's fine. But it's not fine. That's not at all fine. And he says, when the rains come, when God finally gets ticked off enough, and God comes and destroys this wall, I'm going to be the guy over here saying, so what happened to that wall there that you said was structurally sound and everything was fine? He called it out. You're lying. We don't do that, do we? No, we can't do that. Because if we do that, we're going to offend somebody. Well, guess what? If you read the gospel of Jesus Christ and you are not offended by things, you are not reading the gospel of Jesus Christ. The things that break Jesus' heart should break our heart as well. At what point, when reading the words of Jesus, do we see Jesus compared to Santa Claus or Oprah Winfrey just throwing things at people? At what point do we see that it is okay to degrade your fellow human being, to not help one another? I've studied this book, I've studied the Gospels for so long, and I have not found either of those in the Gospel. And yet that is what is being told to people. Right now, in this very moment, all across the nation, you have people in churches, and some of them are saying outright lies to people. We need to get back to the basics, is what we really need to do. The actual heart of the gospel of Jesus Christ. One that includes a call to realize the sin in us. One that includes the necessity for coming before the Lord, for bearing your soul before the Lord, and asking God to help you. Because guess what? We can't help ourselves. To echo Pilate, then, we have to ask ourselves the famous question, what is truth? How can we possibly know the truth? How can we, when there are so many people saying so many different things, actually know what comes from God and what doesn't? At the core of this question is the same question that Jesus was asked by the Pharisees. In an attempt to trap Jesus, because he had already dispatched with the Sadducees, a lawyer comes up to them. Smart, suave, sophisticated, a well-learned individual. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? Now, we're not just talking the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are sort of like an overarching, all-encompassing thing of all of the law, the Torah. We're talking about a lot of, basically, the first 5 books of the Bible is typically referred to as the law or the Torah. And a lot of those books have a lot of laws. And so what this person is doing is they're coming before Jesus and they're saying, pick one. Pick one and tell me what the most important thing is for us to do. Which in and of itself is a nigh impossible task because, again, we're talking about a lot of laws. And so Jesus, being in typical Jesus fashion, he doesn't give them one. He gives them 2. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. But he doesn't stop there. And a second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On this, Jesus says, hang all of the law and the prophets. Boiling things down to the smallest, most easily graspable thing that he could possibly think of, he gives them 2 rules in which everything else, every other rule found in the law, everything said by the prophets, everything is encompassed in these 2 simple rules. Love God, love your neighbor. That's it. Love God, love your neighbor. Jesus said these 2 things sum up the entirety of the books of the law, the entirety of the writing of the prophets. And right there is your measuring stick. Right there is your measuring stick. If someone says something to you and it doesn't honor God, throw it away. If someone says something to you and it doesn't love your neighbor, it doesn't make you feel like you should love your neighbor as yourself, you throw it away. Because that is not the gospel of Jesus Christ. Jesus came to fulfill the law. Jesus didn't abolish the law. Jesus fulfilled the law. In every way that we could not fulfill the law, Jesus did. One of those things is by loving the unlovable, by caring for those who have no voice, for defending those who have been alienated, for seeking the lost. That is what Jesus did. And Jesus' own actions fulfilled the law. Not only did Jesus love all peoples, but Jesus loved God. With everything that he was, Jesus loved God. That's it. That's the measuring stick. That right there is what we are supposed to do. So when you hear people talking and saying things like, oh, this is what Jesus would do, we need to examine it. We need to stop being so passive. The problem is that oftentimes we are a consumer culture. And we just consume things. We don't take a step back. We don't analyze. We just say, give me this, and I'll deal with it later. We just accept things. But when someone stands in front of you, and seriously, do this with me too, because I need to be held accountable too. Someone stands in front of you and says, they speak for God, and they are telling you something that does not both honor God and love other people. Leave. Because that is not the gospel. The truth of the matter is, the real truth is that the gospel should not be watered down. Because if you are dealing with a gospel that does not personally convict you, that does not make you want to change, you are not dealing with the gospel. We must decrease so that Christ may increase. There's a lot of people saying a lot of things about Jesus and about God. We focus on the words of Christ. We focus on the actions of Jesus Christ. That is our measuring stick. And if you hear someone say something that does not match up with that, call them out. Tell them. This world doesn't need more darkness. This world doesn't need more hurt. This world does not need more lies. What this world needs is the authentic, genuine truth found only in the person of Jesus Christ. Amen.